Sunday, August 7, 2022, and welcome to the 25th episode in this series from Midas Touch and 5-Minute News called The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can download the show as audio in addition to my daily 5-Minute News podcast on iTunes or wherever you get yours. Joining me today is physician, a forensic scientist, and world expert on violence. She leads a project group for the World Health Organization and is currently president of the World Mental Health Coalition. She consulted with governments on prison reform and community violence prevention, both around the country and around the world. She's authored many books, over a dozen in fact, including The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Welcome, Dr. Bandy Lee. Dr. Lee, hi. Thank you very much for being with us here on the Weekend Show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let me start by saying that I actually think you're a very brave person. Why do you think I would think that you are brave? Are you able to answer that question?
Well,
I mean, not for coming on this show, but for speaking out in the way that you have.
Yes, I'm rather surprised to find that this is surprising, because I felt that I was merely responding to my professional responsibility. In fact, going back to early 2017, I and my colleagues, in fact, I had many colleagues who are counted among the most respected in the field of psychiatry, we came together and believed that Donald Trump in the office of the presidency was so dangerous that we had a medical and professional responsibility to society to issue a warning about it. So that was when we began immediately with my conference at Yale School of Medicine, and then the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. It was an unprecedented bestseller of its kind, which spoke also to the hunger on the part of the public. So I did not see that as anything really out of the ordinary. We are doing the duty. What was extraordinary was the situation. And we were meeting a public need. And we did so, perhaps we sounded hyperbolic at first, but it was based on our expertise, having the knowledge and clinical background and experience in public health as we did. We were concerned about the public, not about Donald Trump as a person. And it was not political concerns that drove us. So I felt that it was pretty much a response that would be a matter of course. In fact, just about everyone we spoke to, all our colleagues agreed with us. We had a medical consensus. But I believe that as time went on and our voices became more and more marginalized, I believe because it is precisely the information that would empower the public and that was necessary for the public to protect itself, that we were pretty much driven out. And as that was happening, when it became a choice between one's career and meeting one's professional responsibility, one's medical responsibility and professional ethics, then people were faced with a tough choice and many fell away. That said, hundreds and later thousands of mental health professionals joined us, which was how we formed the World Mental Health Coalition. And we have taken action in many ways that I think have helped educate the public, but certainly no longer having the platform that we did early on. It was very difficult. In the very beginning, I was invited to just about all the major network and cable news programs. There wasn't one that I wasn't invited to. But later on, producers, writers, even reporters would try to get us on and simply would not get it approved.
It's very interesting to me. I mean, I think this is where independent journalism has really kind of come into its own in the last few years in the United States. And there are some amazing people doing incredible work because the mainstream media is beholden to shareholders. They are businesses, ultimately, and I mean, people didn't even watch CNN until Donald Trump came along, right? You know, these stations were on in gymnasiums or in hotel lobbies, but people weren't kind of glued to them. And the circus that came with Donald Trump gave these networks ratings, and so therefore they wanted to promote Donald Trump, even networks that were on the left. They saw him as a great draw. And that really is the tragedy of American media, I guess. And that's what compelled people like me to set up 5 Minute News and certainly many others who I know. Let's address the elephant in the room. And that is that mental health is still taboo, right? Despite the fact that, you know, people are getting better at being open about it. And, you know, I've been in therapy for years. You know, I put myself into therapy and I'm very proud of being in therapy. It's made me a better person. And it was, you know, it was for personal reasons. It was more about becoming a father and wanting to be a better father than my father was to me, kind of simple things. But for everybody, it's different. And our relationship with mental health professionals is a very intimate one. You know, Donald Trump would never admit to being mentally ill, of course, because, you know, he is prevented from having any flaws, you know, the way his mind works. But I'm not a mental health professional, but it seemed obvious to me, even before he ran for president, even just seeing him in interviews, that this guy had some serious mental health issues that I was able to diagnose from afar without any qualifications. And yet the greatest criticism that yourself and your colleagues have received from Republicans and Donald Trump supporters is, how is it possible to diagnose someone without even having met them? So let's just deal with that, really, the first issue, that, you know, mental health is not something that people are very open about in the United States, and how you are able to get into the mind of somebody who you haven't met.
Well, what one can get into and not get into depends on the science. In fact, there are certain conditions that we can only assess from afar, such as dangerousness depends on knowing about the situation, getting collateral reports. It does not depend on a personal interview. And diagnosis for treatment, which is very much the concept that the right-wing media and even the American Psychiatric Association tried to promote. And I should mention that I quit the organization because of its heavy ties to the pharmaceutical industry, would not welcome the fact and the knowledge and even our responsibility as psychiatric professionals to be involved in matters of public health. And so because this was a public health matter and a matter of dangerousness that tied very closely with mental unfitness, which is also another type of evaluation that we do apart from diagnosis. In fact, again, diagnosis is only when one is doing a personal treatment situation that is relevant. And therefore, the whole discourse was carried in a way that was irrelevant to the situation at hand. In fact, I believe that it was deliberately taken that way, and it was because the knowledge that we had to give to the public was important and critical. In fact, after the Yale conference, I was invited by dozens of Congress members to speak with them. And eventually I spoke with more than 50 Congress members. And they have consistently said that if we could educate the public on medical matters, that they could intervene politically, that if we were able to turn the public around. And I met with Jamie Raskin as well, who was formulating at that time modifications to the 25th Amendment, which would allow it to be used more easily. And he himself had also spoken with John Feerick, the author of the 25th Amendment, who invited me to a number of his workshops, and we had spoken in conferences together, that for the 25th Amendment to be implemented appropriately, that it should be data-driven. That was one thing he emphasized, and medical data are part of what can do that. So blocking those medical data was critical to keeping Donald Trump in the presidency. And I would not say that the American public was as unaware of mental health issues or were as stigmatizing of mental health as they are now, because I was in fact astonished early in the Trump presidency and before that at the interest that we were consulted, just like any other expert of any other field. And as I told you, I was invited to just about every major news network, cable and otherwise, and it was only after, in fact, the American Psychiatric Association came out and said that we were practicing armchair psychiatry and using psychiatry as a political tool, which I believe actually they were projecting what they were doing.
Well, that's often the case, though, isn't it? And I guess that
yes.
projection is probably going to be a big theme of this conversation today. Can we talk about this suppression of truth, as you call it, and explain a little bit about the Goldwater Rule of 1973 that was changed, wasn't it? Just explain what that means and why it was maybe changed.
Yes, what alarmed me was not so much, in fact, the Goldwater Rule is insignificant. It's not even a rule. That's a misnomer. And indeed, it was considered outdated even when it entered into the books in 1973, based on a 1964 presidential election of Goldwater campaign. And so to elevate such an insignificant so-called rule that was not taught in any residency or any psychiatric training program, which most psychiatrists at the time did not even know about, should be elevated to being more important than the danger to public health that Donald Trump posed.
So for people that don't know what it is, let's just explain it. The Goldwater Rule prevents professionals from diagnosing public figures. Is that right?
That is how it is publicized. Actually, the Goldwater Rule falls under the guideline that psychiatrists participate in activities that improve the community and promote public health. So it's actually an affirmative obligation where if we are asked about a public figure, just don't diagnose since we haven't examined them personally.
But
that's perfectly reasonable.
The change came just a few months after Trump was in office, right? So
yes,
what was March 2017? So who changed that and what was their impetus?
So the American Psychiatric Association issued a public statement that they were reaffirming the Goldwater Rule, but what in fact they did was create a new gag order in that they modified the just do not diagnose clause into do not make any comment of any kind as related to the president, drawing from psychiatric knowledge and experience.
Right.
And that
because they knew that they were dealing with a madman. They'd won office. They were, the people behind this, and this is me saying this now. This is not you saying. I'm not putting words into your mouth, but it just seems very obvious that this was a politically motivated decision because they got their guy installed, the help of Russia and various, whatever was behind it. But they got their guy in, and they didn't want to have anybody questioning his ability to be president, and they certainly didn't want to invoke the 25th.
Well, whether or not they got the guy they wanted in, they needed to not be in the crosshairs of the guy who was in power.
Okay,
and
yeah.
I believe it was indeed political expediency because it made no sense from a logical, ethical, psychiatric, scientific point of view that they would make this change to a rule that was already becoming, since 1980, we don't require a personal interview for a diagnosis.
Yeah.
So it was very odd. Well, they got a brand new building in the middle of Washington, D.C., and they have been showered with unprecedented federal funding since.
Yeah.
And that alone should alarm the public as to what institutions are doing to incur political favors.
I mean, we had a similar thing with the George V in England, the King of England, who went crazy and he was kind of hidden from the public. There is precedent for this. And, to be mentally ill or unwell or unable to carry out your duties can happen to anybody at any time in any job. But I just want to talk about Donald Trump specifically and when you first became alarmed. And the reason I ask this is because there was an article in Vanity Fair that was published in November 2015, so 2 years before the presidency. And the headline was, "Is Donald Trump actually a narcissist? Therapists weigh in." It says, as his presidential campaign trundles forward, millions of sane Americans are wondering what exactly is wrong with this strange individual. When did alarm bells go off for you? How early on? Was it when he was toying with the idea of running for president?
Well, I grew up in New York, so I knew about Donald Trump for quite some time. I merely thought of him as a shady businessman and kind of an odious personality, but I did not think of him as dangerous. But by the time he was running, I had done plenty of psychiatric training and had plenty of experience. And so it was one view of him on the campaign trail where he was interacting with his followers that I recognized him as the dangerous personality that I had been treating as a forensic psychiatrist for over 20 years at that point. Now, I might mention that being a narcissist is not necessarily a disqualifier. Level of narcissism is. And so whether one has a mental illness or not is also not a disqualifier, but the level of it that would render one unfit. And there are also numerous circumstances where one does not have to have a mental illness to be unfit.
So what was he doing on the campaign trail that set you off?
Well, he was interacting with his followers in ways that that augmented his dangerous rhetoric, that showed that he interacted with them on the basis of a dangerous psychology, where he would be attracted to dangerous means to getting his ends, and that he was actually marveling at his own ability to incite violence, to speak about violence, and he even spoke about shooting someone on Fifth Avenue, and he would still have followers. And so he was recognizing that his own mental defect was in fact attracting others who are seeking that kind of compensation or that kind of a synergy. I said as early as, in 2017 on Democracy Now!, I said that he has shown an attraction to violence as a coping strategy. And that was what was manifesting. Of course, in the beginning of the presidency, we did not know there would be a pandemic or an insurrection. But we knew that were there a crisis, Donald Trump did not have the mental capacity to handle it. And that mental capacity was showing itself from the very early days. In fact, it was within seconds of watching him that I recognized this dangerousness and lack of capacity.
Did you think that his political flip-flopping in previous decades was an issue? He famously said, if I was ever going to be run for president, I'd run as a Republican because, that lot are so stupid they'd vote for, I could convince them to vote for me, or words to that effect. And, but actually he'd been a Democrat and he'd donated to both parties. And really it was all about power from very early on for him. And I mean, it's well written that he didn't really want to be president. He wanted to set up a TV network, Trump TV, from the basement of Mar-a-Lago. And he was using the campaign really to kind of promote himself so that when he lost, he could then go and have this kind of, right-wing news outlet. And obviously that never came to fruition. He just took control of Fox News by telephone often. But Does that make a difference? I mean, we've seen plenty of politicians over the years change their political allegiance, haven't we? But did it make a difference to you from your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's the difference between a mental health professional's perspective and a lay perspective. If you look at the situation from lay terms, his flip-flopping may look the same as an ordinary politician strategizing. But if you understand the underlying lack of competence and lack of stability, then you understand that he has no ideology. He has no grounding in things that, in fact, ordinary, normal human beings would be grounded by. And that's really the dangerous part of his mental compromise. And that he simply would not be capable of staying with an ideology or a political perspective, or even be caring of others in ways that would beholden them to him.
Let's just talk about young Donald Trump, because, you know, the first question I got asked by my therapist was, tell me about your childhood, right? So much has been written about Trump idolizing his father, the real estate mogul who famously wouldn't rent property to black people. And so there was this kind of undertone of racism from very early on. And, you know, they were very much known as a kind of mob family, crime family in New York. And anybody like yourself who grew up in New York knew of this kind of these unsavory people. I've read all this stuff about him and his dad and idolizing his dad, but I read very little about his mum. And, you know, I sense that actually his mum might be a bit of a linchpin here in terms of, you know, him as a young boy not getting the attention that he deserved, not getting the love and affection, maternal affection from his own mother, let alone his father, who was in a league of his own. Have you done much analysis of his childhood in order to come to conclusions about his adulthood?
Yes, indeed, there was plenty of information available about his upbringing, and the facts would concord with his current state, in that he was abandoned, or he would have experienced as abandonment, when his mother went into the hospital because of medical problems, medical complications from his younger brother's birth, when he was 2.5 years old. And so when you have a father who is showing plenty of pathological traits himself, and then an absent mother, then of course one will not be able to receive much of what the rest of us take for granted. But I don't wish to focus too much on the psychological dynamics or the pathology in particular, because what is really important is the degree of dangerousness and the degree to which that would render him unfit. And now it's not just the coup from the coup conspiracy that led to January 6th, on which, you know, there have been influential January 6th committee hearings now, but that Donald Trump is likely guilty of mass murder. He's guilty of willful or at least grossly negligent manslaughter of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And this is not ordinarily talked about.
So this is, are you talking about the response to COVID and his delayed response to that, and not taking it seriously and telling people to drink bleach or shine a light inside the body? I mean, are you talking about that level of negligence that creates the danger? Because there has been statistics now counted as to how many deaths there would have been in the United States had Donald Trump taken COVID-19 seriously.
So whatever the legal charge, that is what is important from a medical perspective. Had we intervened in time, the vast majority of deaths from COVID in the United States would not have happened. And so that's why we were vociferously urging that we stop him from the very beginning of the pandemic. In fact, within weeks of the pandemic's announcement in March of 2020, we issued our prescription for survival, which emphasized that press conferences couldn't be held in the White House, that medical professionals at the CDC needed to lead the discourse on the pandemic, because public education at a time in the absence of vaccines or treatments is critical to public health intervention. And so this kind of medical concern is why we were speaking up. In fact, at that critical time, we said, we have a presidency that is incapable of protecting lives, but is making a global pandemic deadlier. And that is why we felt that it was a concern of ours. And of course, there was the January 6th insurrection that came after his attempt to subvert democracy through a coup to stay in power. All these were predictable based on his psychological structure. And now he's subverted many of our cherished institutions, including the American presidency. All of this was foreseeable as well, not to mention emboldening dictators from around the world. And we have encountered these mental symptoms in other settings, along with their contagion across groups such as street gangs or cults or families or communities. This is what is familiar to us. I've called fascism not a political ideology, but mental pathology in politics for this very reason. And now American fascism has already taken hold. And this is really the serious part about allowing the Trump presidency to go unchecked. Now it is grafted on top of the culture we already had, the destructive culture of racism, imperialism, and an overturning of a rational geopolitical world order has now happened as a result of this presidency. And this is without even going into the existential crisis of the climate catastrophe, which I have dubbed our collective suicidal tendency, even before the Trump presidency. And more than any other person, Donald Trump has unleashed this. And now outright psychological manipulation and violence against citizens has become a way that is accepted as a legitimate way of governing. And this is really the concern, the psychological warning signs that we have seen from the beginning that has now spread unchecked because an appropriate intervention has not been made. In fact, it astonishes me at times just how little veered away from our early predictions. And it is exactly as we feared would happen without intervention.
But isn't this the problem when you're trying to be responsible as a clinician in a country that is so politically divided? And it's a little bit like, the conspiracy theorists about COVID would go looking for medical professionals who were also conspiracists about COVID, and they found them. It is possible to find quack doctors, some of whom are very official. I mean, there was one particular woman who, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, who looked after Trump, when he got COVID and wore a white coat and was with 50 other doctors, and they all presented this united front. And the reality was they were all anti-vaxxers. This is the problem. There are always going to be professionals with other opinions, and their opinion is formed from politics and their allegiance rather than science. And we saw this at the climate change conferences at COP, where you have an entire sub-conference going on the other side of the road full of climate change denying scientists. And, it's often paid for by the oil industry, and there's dark forces at play just to try and bring balance. And I want to quote a few people that criticized you that you have mentioned to me. Professor Lawrence Tribe from Harvard Law School said, "This is a disgusting way for any university to act. Dr. Bandy Lee should never have been fired." This is obviously because Yale turned against you effectively for having an opinion, a scientific and a professional
For
opinion.
allegedly breaking the
Right.
Goldwater Rule, which we
Yeah.
haven't broken. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association's new version is what we have broken, which we do not agree with, that we believe it violates medical neutrality, all the tenets of medical ethics going back to the Geneva Declaration that was instituted after the experience of Nazism, that physicians should ally themselves with the humanitarian goals of medicine, not with a destructive
But it's all about money,
regime.
isn't it? You know, it's Yale. It's Yale getting funding, and so therefore, you know, they need to take a position, and that's politics. It's playing politics. It's the networks taking positions because they need to make money and do business. So that's why they're not having you on. It's a very This is
Well,
America,
that's why.
right?
That's why, if I may, it is important for the 98% of climate scientists who are in agreement to speak up, and for the 99.9% of psychiatrists who are in agreement about Donald Trump to speak up, that speaking up per se is not political, because the situation itself is so dire, and the medical need requires it. And that is how I've interpreted my role as a neutral medical professional. I have never involved myself in politics before. In fact, this was the very first time. And the reason why I have done so is because the situation called for it, and the principles of medical ethics demanded that I do so.
This is why I said you were brave at the beginning of this conversation, you know, because I've learned that America is a very different beast to certainly Europe, where I'm from, where, you know, Donald Trump has spent his life suing people or firing people, you know, people that were not subservient, people that were not sycophantic. He just is rid of them. But the difference between running your personal business, the Trump organization, and running America's business in the White House is that you are accountable and that you are a public figure and you will be diagnosed by people. In fact, you are, I mean, this happened with Princess Diana in England when she was alive. She was famously the most photographed woman in the world, right? She was not only the interviews that she gave, but just the paparazzi, but also just being videoed, getting out of a car and going into a nursery, all sorts of things. You know, she was on camera all the time. Tragically, it ended up killing her. But in the case of Donald Trump, he is the most photographed, recorded person on the planet between the years of like 2016 through 2020. In fact, well, even now. And therefore, with all that video evidence and all those, even those long phone calls he would make to Fox News, you know, to Fox and Friends, where they were literally trying to get the president off the phone because it was like grandpa was ringing us up and was just like talking garbage. All of this is evidence for people like you to work with, to explore the inner workings of this mind. So to go back to those people that say, how can you diagnose someone without a meeting? You've actually got more evidence than if you had met him in person for 1 hour.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, when I was giving grand rounds at Harvard Medical School, the psychiatrists there, the Harvard psychiatrists themselves have said that they know more about Donald Trump than any patient they've ever treated. And to close our eyes and close our ears to this dangerous public health threat was, in my view, out of the ordinary of what medical professionals have been called to do. And in fact, I had thought that if I'm called to consult with policymakers and government officials on far less greater dangers, then why in this situation would I remain silent? And that is why silence did not make sense to me, and did not make sense to a lot of my colleagues. That is why we came out in unprecedented ways in American history. In fact, Lawrence O'Donnell said with the publication of our book that it was an historic work in the history of American psychiatry. And I had already said in the prologue that for a man who is both evil and mentally compromised, power not only corrupts, but also magnifies existing psychopathologies, even as it creates new ones. So the dangers were great.
Let's talk about the violence aspect, because this is your area of expertise.
Yes.
And we can look at violence on multiple levels with Donald Trump. There was a video released recently by the January 6th committee showing the outtakes from him making that recording the day after January 6th, where he was supposed to condemn the violence and he kind of didn't, and he still wouldn't accept that the election was fair. And it was a real eye-opener. But to me, it was the temper, the sucking of the teeth and the pointing to the door, and this kind of anger with himself for not being able to get it right, but trying to blame other people, not being able to say the word yesterday, saying it was too difficult a word for him, and then trying to backtrack because he realized that saying, "Oh, I can't say yesterday," makes him look weak. And so then he was like, well, actually, let's just change it. And then Ivanka, I mean, it was a dream for those of us that take enough of an interest in the inner workings of this guy's mind. I saw this internal Donald Trump in that video that we hadn't really seen so much of previously, because when he's on stage, he's actually rather brilliant. He's a much better communicator than Joe Biden. He's got the gags. He's more fluent. He's more lucid. He's got, he's a younger, albeit fatter man, but for some reason he is still quite capable. He's like a stand-up comedian. In fact, comedians have analyzed his pentameter, and he's actually quite good at doing recall and bringing things back and going back to stories. He's actually a showman. And maybe that's all he ever was, a showman. But in this video, we actually saw this nasty guy, didn't we? We saw the swearing, we saw the anger. We've heard stories of how angry he has got in the Oval Office, throwing the ketchup at the wall. We've heard recordings of him being vile, misogynistic, the famous recording on the bus. There are two sides to this guy. How does he manage to maintain this public persona and yet behind the scenes be a really unhappy, angry, aggressive and violent man?
Well, the two sides are of the same coin. In fact, the charisma that you see, many people mistook it for strategy, but I would say that it is far more effective than strategy because these come from his mental pathology. That in fact his inner sheer drive to compensate for what he deep down knows is his inadequacy and worthlessness, what he perceives as his worthlessness and emptiness. This is far greater than what any of us normal individuals would be able to imagine. So as a compensation for it, he has this enormous, out of proportion drive to, in fact, he is fighting for his life, his psychic life, when he is putting on a performance. But of course, his true self is the opposite of what he is projecting to others. But unfortunately, many of us see through him and see that all this is false. But his followers, unfortunately, in times of crisis or deprivation or vast changes in society where people's collective mental health is in a lesser state, individuals are more attracted to this kind of demagogue, if you will, who promises them outlandish things that an ordinary person would not be attracted to. But that's because they're thirsting for something that they cannot have, really. They're thirsting to go back to their childhood and to have a parent figure as their leader. And
That
so,
machismo thing, though, is very interesting, isn't it? Because if you're saying he feels inadequate, and I presume the reason that he's overweight is because he eats to try and fill the emptiness, as well as having a poor diet. You know, he famously said, "I only eat McDonald's because at least you know where it's come from," which is, for me, one of the great quotes in history. It's like, don't make that guy president. But what about at the G20 when he was like pushing past world leaders to get to the front, jostling to get to the front? I mean, does this come from a place of knowing that he doesn't have the knowledge, he doesn't have the education, he doesn't know about world events or international trade? He's completely on a grift. The whole thing is a grift. And so the only way to really prevent being exposed as a grifter is to push beyond what is considered normal and to be a bully.
well, to convince himself above all.
Right.
We know that he constantly lies to himself because that is the only way he could simply relax. The peace of mind that the rest of us have in ordinary life is not available to him. He's constantly at war with the world. And so he's constantly fighting for benefits to himself at the expense of others because it's a zero-sum game for him. But in the end, he is self-destructive, as you said about his eating habits. He is by definition self-destructive, even as he convinces himself that he is doing things for his benefit, and even as he convinces others. And that is the unfortunate part, that too many have been convinced that he is good for them, and that whether they are deceived by his pretenses and overly grandiose talk, or whether they feel that they could benefit and profit from his grifting by allying with him, that eventually all of us will be driven to destruction as a result of these people's false beliefs.
But do you think deep down his supporters know that he is an empty vessel? They're just like the fact that he's disrupting the status quo, that he is draining the swamp, as he called it, even though he very much represents the swamp. Is it that he's very claimed to be like an anti-politician, to be the kind of a rebel, when in fact he was the very establishment, from the very establishment that he claims to despise?
Yes, I believe the establishment has made use of him. Even if it did not know to do so in the beginning, they realized that mental pathology is a much greater, more powerful magnet than any kind of strategy or rational solutions, actual solutions. And therefore, we have fallen into a very self-destructive and pathological path that once we spiral into it, it's very hard to get out of. And so that's why prevention was so important, and why we felt it was so important to speak up early, from very early on, because prevention is far more feasible than intervention after the fact. And we have gotten to this state where now we've come to dangerous peril on all fronts. But still, it is quintessential that Donald Trump and his co-conspirators be criminally indicted and convicted, because that will prevent further danger. I mean, all options are not ideal, even dangerous. But for the sake of the health of the nation, in order to prevent an even more dangerous situation, holding Donald Trump and those who work closely with him criminally accountable is really of foremost importance. If not that, as medical professionals, we could continue to speak up about his unfitness for office from the beginning. Unfitness having continued and having spread does not mean that the unfitness is any less relevant. In fact, it points to the even greater dangers of Donald Trump's mental incapacity. And in fact, suggestions have been made to us that it is time for the book, The Much More Dangerous Case of Donald Trump and
Yeah.
America.
Yeah. Well, it's got worse because he's now become a pastiche of himself. He's obviously watched himself on TV so many times, or watched playback of his rallies, or which, narcissists tend to want to do, to really kind of marinate themselves in their own production, that I kind of hear him repeating himself in a way that is different now. And obviously he's a few years older as well. And so there is clearly some cognitive decline. Before we get into, bang up to date, with where we're at now with the insurrection and everything else, I just want to go back to something that I read that you said several years ago. And that was that everything you needed to know about Donald Trump had already been published in the Mueller report. And that actually this whole projection, Russia, his ability to turn, because he knew full well that he had relationships with Russia. It was widely documented. The Steele dossier out of the UK detailed it very accurately, and he tried to, all Republicans have tried to make that look like it had no credence, and it was in fact quite the opposite. And a lot of the Steele dossier ended up in the Mueller report. But, this guy was helped by Russia to get elected through social media campaigns and various things. Arguably, there was compromat as well, whether it be the PP tape or something that Russia had over him, but also money being lent. That's often a way to, create a bribe. Just explain to me and to people who maybe think that the Mueller report had fallen flat on its face, how important that document was to somebody such as yourself.
Yes, first let me say that with respect to Russia, compromat or not, the psychological pull of Vladimir Putin at the time, the fact that he could hold summits with him, and the fact that they shared a similar psychology and therefore were doting on each other, and they fall into a domination submission mode that these personalities tend to go into. That would be a much stronger pull than any compromat that us ordinary persons could conceive of. What was significant about the Mueller report was that until that time, we were warning against the dangers of Donald Trump. Now, warning about dangerousness, alerting to signs of dangerousness, that's a preliminary assessment. And in fact, we do it all the time before we even see a person, or when we decide to see a person, is dependent on that initial assessment of danger. Now, to do a full assessment of a dangerous risk assessment, and therefore also of unfitness, is a whole other standardized procedure. So until that time, we had no structured interviews. We did not have official reports from the White House, from his co-workers. And this is the kind of information that would allow us to go step by step and perform a standardized fitness exam of higher caliber than anywhere we have done in our careers, because these are under sworn testimony. And we were able to do that to a measure of certainty far greater than we ordinarily are required to do before a person is removed from their job. And what we found that was, in fact, I can quote a passage from you. We said that he failed every criterion of sound mental capacity to make rational, reality-based decisions, which are critical to functioning in the role of president. Now, this is without going into any of the other requirements of the job of the presidency. This is a basic medical fitness test. And we determined that he failed every criterion. This means he was not only unfit for the office of president, but just about any job.
But yet perfect.
Whatsoever.
He was perfect as a Russian mark, though, wasn't he? Because, all of this unfitness for political office was because he was oblivious. He basically was somebody that is easy to manipulate. And, we've seen that now with the way that he was kind of forced by others to stack the Supreme Court with Christian nationalists, and which has now seen the overturning of Roe, which is going to have a devastating effect on America. I just want to talk about some of the things that he did in his presidency that you might say would never have happened, extreme things, if a president who was equally right-wing but not mentally unfit, would have done. And I have a few personal favorites. The one I mention on the show all the time is the Muslim ban that was on, within the first week of the presidency. Because it was the language, it was him puffing himself up, and he said, and I remember the words, I'm not looking them up, he said, I'm calling for a complete and total ban of all Muslims entering the United States until we can work out what the hell is going on. I mean, you've got two completely different things there, haven't you? You've got this statement, yes, a complete and total ban of all Muslims, which sounds very official, and then until we can work out what the hell is going on, which is actually, I translate that as being until I've read something about it, because I don't know what the hell's going on. I've just been told that maybe it would be a good idea to ban Muslims. Is that a good place to start?
Yes, because there's no logical connection between the two factors, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But there is a different kind of connection, which is an emotional one and a pathological one. And the connections that he makes and the manipulations he can effectuate as a result of those pathological connections would be dangerous, far more dangerous than someone, say, who was incompetent because of dementia or because of schizophrenia. Even a president who would run around naked with a tinfoil hat on his head would be less dangerous than the pathology that Donald Trump has. And that is often what is deceptive, because one of the features of his defect is that it looks sane. In fact, an influential writer on his condition, Hervey Cleckley, in the 1940s, dubbed it a mask of sanity, whereas in fact it wreaks more havoc on society, communities, families than all the other psychiatric conditions combined.
Just going back to violence for a second, do you remember the speech he gave at the Police Federation? And I quote, he said, when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, the way you put their hand over, like don't hit their head, and they've just killed somebody. Don't hit their head. I said, you can take that hand away. Okay, I'm quoting. And, nothing he says makes sense. So that's why it didn't make sense to me reading it. He basically was suggesting to police officers that they should allow suspects, when arrested, to hit their heads on the car. Now, this is very subtle, isn't it? Because this is giving license to police officers, many of whom we know now are far-right extremists, members of militia groups, and are happy to, execute black people in broad daylight. This was a smoke signal, wasn't it?
Yes, and most significantly of all, he was setting a kind of cultural shift to allow for more police brutality and all the factors that make policing in this country ineffective. He has essentially enabled by that statement and others. And that is also the way by which white supremacists, those who would be violent, took advantage of this presidency, of having a dangerous, violence-prone president and an unfit one to advance many of their agendas, including, everything from the repealing of the Roe v. Wade decision to suppression of voting rights. We have now an entire infrastructure of suppressing votes because he not only unleashed a measure of police brutality there, he also unleashed a different kind of thinking. a different kind of logic that is, even madness has its method, in that there's a different logic that was given permission to during his presidency. And if the president can do this, why can we not? And now we see multiple replications of his style in local and regional governments.
And around the world as well. We've seen it. We've seen it in Brazil. We've seen it in Turkey. And I fear that the knock-on effect of Trumpism, it will last generations, because it has kind of unleashed the beast, right? This, if the guy at the top says it's okay to gas your own citizens so that you can walk through a park to do a photo opportunity outside a church holding a Bible, which is effectively what happened on that day. He effectively sent his, police militia to kind of remove peaceful protesters in a very violent way, the kind that you would see in countries that do not have democracy.
Yes, and that is why recognizing his psychological unfitness from an expert perspective was critical to communicate to the public, because this wasn't someone we just disagreed with. This wasn't someone with just a few deficiencies. This was someone who was dangerously impaired in ways that required us to be speaking about just why we believed he was impaired. Medical signs are not often, some signs may not necessarily be salient to the untrained eye. And so what mental health professionals could do was to distinguish between what is within the wide range normal that humans exhibit and what enters into the realm of pathological and dangerous. And so that's in 2019, the organization that formed from the mental health professionals who came forward, the World Mental Health Coalition, held an interdisciplinary conference in the ballroom of the National Press Club. And we invited 13 of the top experts of all different fields. And we spoke of the dangerous state of the world and the need for fit leadership. Jeffrey Sachs moderated the meeting, and Jamie Raskin came and spoke about the 25th Amendment also. And I also spoke on CNN in 2019 on reliable sources that we are not concerned about Mr. Trump's personal mental health, but about his effects on society. For example, we could have said that the assessment by the now disgraced White House Dr. Ronnie Jackson, when he declared the president mentally fit, that he was not in a position to be able to do so. Not only was he not trained in mental health, but he was employed by the president. In fact, a personal physician cannot independently assess fitness for duty for an individual, especially if they are one's subordinate.
And Ronnie Jackson has turned out to be a far-right Republican, hasn't he? I mean, this is, even though he presided over the Obama administration as well, and Obama actually called him out just a couple of weeks ago and wrote to him. And Ronnie Jackson's reaction was to make a video with a gun, kind of doubling down on his support for Donald Trump.
And look where his medical compromise and his willingness to violate medical ethics has gotten him. He almost became a cabinet member when he was tried to be put in charge of the VA, and now he's a Congress member. And these kinds of things would not have been possible without an unfit president. And I had also said that even the appointment of Supreme Court justices, his choice of appointments are likely to be unfit themselves, and they have exhibited numerous signs of unfitness. So this reveals a gaping hole in our system, in that mental fitness tests are required. Mental fitness is required of all professions, and except for elected office. But even the military personnel who handle nuclear weapons have to pass a rigorous psychological test every year to be able to continue in their work. But the commander-in-chief who
ultimately gets the decision to press the nuclear button does
Yes.
not. I have a final question for you, because we need to wrap up, and this really brings it bang up to date with January 6th, proving that Trump was intentionally subverting the election, the 2020 election, is going to be a difficult ask, because Trump has been sticking to his story that the election was stolen. Even now, he's doing rallies now, and he's still saying it was stolen. He has not veered from the script at all. Now, that could be problematic for prosecutors, couldn't it? Because, if you are going to say the guy's mentally unwell, and if he's going to say, well, I was told that the election was stolen and that there was fraud, and so I was just doing good work on behalf of citizens and voters to make sure that it absolutely wasn't, it was legitimate. This is going to be questionable in a court of law, isn't it? His position on mental health. And this is why I've often said, I don't want to say that Trump is completely nuts, because I don't want to kind of absolve him of responsibility. So how do we qualify
those are two
this?
different issues.
Yeah.
It should not be concluded that mental defect automatically leads to an insanity defense. In fact, the type of defect he has actually predisposes to criminality and is not eligible for an insanity defense. And so we should emphasize his mental defect in this case. Well, that's true. In order to charge a crime and convict one has to have a guilty mind and a guilty act. The guilty mind is ambiguous only insofar as we do not engage forensic mental health experts, because that is our job. And in fact, we had volunteered a number of interpretations of his intent, of his guilty mind, based on his phone conversations with the Georgia Secretary of State, with his phone call with Vladimir Zelensky, multiple speeches, conversations, and other expressions showed a pattern so as to be able to infer guilty mind, even if it were not obvious to the layperson. In fact, this is one of the reasons why those with the mental defect that Donald Trump has, who are often much more dangerous than the ordinary criminal, are also 2 to 3 times less likely to be prosecuted, because they often fool prosecutors. And even after prosecution, even after conviction, they are 2 times more likely to get a lesser sentence. This is because of the nature of the mental defect that he has, which is the specialty of many forensic psychiatrists. And therefore, that is something that we certainly can analyze and help comment on. And that's one of the reasons why I have started to speak up from the beginning.
Well, I'm very pleased you did. And I repeat that I am impressed with your bravery, because I know how difficult it is, especially when you work for institutions and you crave their support, and it's often difficult to get that. So thank you.
But we also,
yes,
being professionals means we are independent intellectuals, and we are aware that in times of authoritarianism, authority is taken away from intellectuals and journalists, because they are the source of standardized knowledge and facts, and these are critical to the survival and health of a democracy. And that's why it's critical that we speak up all the more when it is difficult.
I mean, it's the same for journalists, and that's why, I maintain that the thing that was most damaging from the Trump presidency was to designate the free press as the enemy of the people and as fake, because we need journalists to call out politicians. That is the checks and balances that is done in a kind of independent environment. There was
exactly.
never enough was said about, this fascist trope of denigrating the free press. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and good luck with your continued campaign, and I hope that you get the coverage that you deserve. I'm Anthony Davis.
Thank you very much.
Not at all. I'm Anthony Davis, and you can subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5 Minute News daily podcast, which drops every morning, so you can listen while you make your coffee, and leave an iTunes review. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.